Here to this, the second part of the shore crawl, and I'm just going to simply hand over to Philip to introduce you.
First thing is, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Good. This lecture is based on a piece I am writing for the forthcoming edition of The Shavier. Many thanks to the editor, Ivan Wise. Thanks to Helen and the Committee of the Shore Society for organising today. And many thanks to this wonderful church. I've never been in here before. It is so beautiful. My name is Philip Wilson, and I teach philosophy and translation at the University of East Anglia. Cards on table, I am not a short scholar. This is a view from the outside. But I am convinced that one of the ways which we can make academic progress is to break down the boundaries between disciplines. To increase mutual understanding has to be a good thing. I personally am revisiting plays that I read when I was in the sixth form, which was a long time ago now. But many of them I've actually managed to see on the stage over the years. For example, I had the great privilege of seeing Withnstops here in London playing St Joan. I'd like to make this as performative as possible. Why? Well, two reasons. First of all, to entertain you. And secondly, to make the point that literature is inherently performative. And maybe philosophy is too. Now, key to this performance aspect is Alexis Leighton, who many of you will know as the actor playing Mrs. Shaw in the play of that name by Helen and Alexis. Today, Alexis has got a fairly easy rota because she's going to play Socrates, George Bernard Shaw, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Eliza Doolittle, and St Joan. That's quite an ensemble, and I think I should thank you. So let's start. Can we think ourselves, please, back to the year 399, before the Common Era, in Athens, in Greece, where a local teacher is on trial for his life. His name is Socrates, and Alexis is going to read part of what he said in his defence.
Someone will say, "Yes, Socrates, but cannot you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city, and no one will interfere with you." Now I have great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this. For if I tell you, this would be a disobedience to a divine command, and therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I am serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, and that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, that you are still less likely to believe.
The words of Socrates from all those years ago, 399, in the democratic Greek city-state of Athens. Here, the elderly Socrates is on trial for his life. Why? He's accused of disrespecting the gods and of corrupting the local youth. The story that we have it, those words, is told by Plato, one of Socrates' followers, in his book, The Apology. Socrates claimed to be the wisest man alive, but oddly enough, he didn't seem to have anything positive to say. Instead, he used to teach the people he was speaking to that everything they knew was wrong. And that doesn't sound like wisdom at all. But Socrates defended himself that he was the wisest man alive, because he was the only person alive who knew that he knew nothing. And Socrates said that he was driven to practice his method because, you heard Alexis say this, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's the foundation statement of Western philosophy. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates described himself as a gadfly who stung people out of their complacency into the hard work of thinking for themselves. Now, to be stung by a gadfly is painful, but it's not fatal. And yet the citizens of Athens condemned Socrates to death. The metaphor of the gadfly can be fittingly applied to George Bernard Shaw. In both his life and his work, he stung and refused to leave well alone, making his audiences re-examine everything they thought they knew. This particular gadfly got away with his life, but Shaw's words can still have a disconcerting effect because they create within the theatre a world where everything is open to question. Shaw's role as a gadfly is neatly irritated by a line in J.B. Priestley's 1946 drama An Inspector Calls, which opens with the Burling family at dinner on a beautiful spring evening in 1912. Life is going very well for the Burlings. The head of the family, a prosperous man of business, dismisses concerns about any European conflict that may be on the way, and insists on the three members of the younger generation hearing what he has to say, because, and I quote, "These Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wellses should not be allowed to dominate the discussion." By the end of the play, however, the Burlings stand condemned in the eyes of the audience. The relentless Socratic questioning of the mysterious Inspector Gould has broken down all pretense of middle-class virtue, and each member of the family is forced to accept that the horrific suicide of a young woman can be directly traced to what they have done, or to what they have failed to do. The spectral visitor stings like a gadfly in a play that confirms the theatre as a vehicle of moral instruction and allows the Bernard Shaws and the H.G. Wellses, and of course by implication the J.B. Priestleys, to speak. Despite society's attempts to impose silence on them, the gadflies are vindicated. But why am I bringing Socrates into a lecture which is essentially about George Bernard Shaw? Well, the answer is fairly simple, because Shaw himself did. In the preface to his play, St Joan, he writes with, I think, great acuteness about Socrates. So let's listen now to George Bernard Shaw himself, in the voice of Alexis, speaking about Joan and Socrates.
If Joan had been a malicious, selfish, cowardly, or stupid, she would have been one of the most odious persons known to history, instead of one of the most attractive. If she had been old enough to know the effect she was producing on the men whom she humiliated by being right when they were wrong, and had learned to flatter and manage them, she might have lived as long as Queen Elizabeth. But she was too young, too rustical, and too inexperienced to have such arts. When she was thwarted by men whom she thought fools, she made no secret of her opinion of them, or her impatience with their folly, and she was naive enough to expect them to be obliged to her for setting them right and keeping them out of mischief. Now, it's always hard for superior wits to understand the fury roused by their exposures of the stupidities of comparative dullards. Even Socrates, for all his age and experience, did not defend himself at his trial like a man who understood the long accumulated fury that had burst on him and was clamouring for his death. His accuser, if born 2,300 years later, might have been picked out of any first-class carriage on a suburban railway during the evening or morning rush from or to the city. For he had really nothing to say, except that he and his like could not endure being shown up as idiots every time Socrates opened his mouth. Socrates, unconscious of this, was paralysed by his sense that somehow he was missing the point of the attack. He petered out after he had established the fact that he was an old soldier and a man of honourable life, and that his accuser was a silly snob. He had no suspicion of the extent to which his mental superiority had roused fear and hatred against him in the hearts of men towards whom he was conscious of nothing but goodwill and good service.
So here in the preface to his 1923 play St Joan, Shaw pairs the heroine, Joan of Arc, with Socrates, and by doing so he sheds light on both figures. To relate the father of Western philosophy to a military saint of 15th century France is a radical move, because at first sight they could not be more different, as Shaw himself says. Socrates was old when he was condemned. He only got away with his intellectual methods for so long because he was a man of argument, as Plato says, who operated slowly and peacefully, as Shaw says, on the minds of his listeners. He wanted to change opinions, not society, and he used non-violent methods. It was his misfortune that society took against the way that his scepticism served to undermine the status quo. There is only so much stinging that some people can take. Joan, by contrast, was what Shaw calls a woman of action, who operated swiftly through overt military violence in her campaign to drive the English from France, a mission that she claimed was warranted by the heavenly voices that had spoken to her. Unlike Socrates, her career was brief, and in 1431 she was consigned to the flames for heresy at the age of, believe it or not, 17. But there are parallels between the two. Both, for example, were loyal to institutions that eventually destroyed them. Socrates was a law-abiding citizen who refused to escape after his condemnation when the opportunity was given to him, while Joan professed her Orthodox Catholic faith to the end. Both have become inspirational figures because they refused to betray the truth as they found it, even though this was to cost them their lives. Today, Socrates' words are read and studied in schools and universities around the world. Joan's statue is to be found in the public squares of France as an object of secular veneration, but also in the Catholic churches of France as an object of religious devotion. For sure, what unites them is their innocence, and I quote, "If Socrates was innocent at the age of 70, it may be imagined how innocent Joan was at the age of 17. Now, whereas the protagonist of a tragedy normally has a fatal flaw, think of something like Othello. Othello's a good person, very trusting, very honest, but he makes this mistake. He trusts the wrong person. He trusts Iago. He therefore believes what Iago says to him, and ends up horrifically killing his wife Desdemona. That's his fatal flaw. And according to Aristotle, all tragedies must have one. But Socrates and Joan don't have done anything wrong from a Shavian point of view. The problem is that they are both Protestants, to use the term that Shaw anachronistically applies to them. How can you call Joan a devout Catholic, the first of the Protestant martyrs? But he does. The word is actually used in the play when the Earl of Warwick describes Joan's insistence on following her own path as, and I quote, "Protestantism, if I have to find a name for it. Protestantism, if I have to find a name for it." The term could also, and equally anachronistically, be applied to Socrates, who followed his conscience against Athenian demands for him to conform, and thus became, in Shaw's term, a Protestant martyr. The aged sage and the young revolutionary look to each other across the centuries through the prism that is Shaw's play. Another factor that connects Socrates and Joan is that they wrote down nothing. I mentioned before that the primary source for information about Socrates is Plato, a great philosopher in his own right who went on to depict his teacher in over 30 dialogues, which may have been acted out by Plato's students at the Academy in Athens. But the situation is complex because in Plato's later dialogues, Socrates seems to be more of a vehicle for what Plato himself wants to say. a persona rather than a person. Now, there are facts about Socrates which are accepted by historians. He was married with 3 children. He went barefoot. He was a soldier before he became a teacher, and so on. But today, it's a question of interpretation. What are we going to make of Plato's presentation of the master? Socrates, for example, appears in several dialogues by Xenophon, a Greek historian. He also appears in the comedy Clouds by Aristophanes, and Aristophanes makes Socrates as a figure of fun who's there to be mocked. So we've actually got more than one Socrates to choose from. And the same is true of Joan. Now, her life can be constructed from contemporary records, but there are many, many, many artistic representations of Joan. Let me give you 3 examples. Interpretation number 1. In 1801, Friedrich von Schiller, German playwright, wrote Die Jungfrau von Orleans, the Virgin, the Maid of Orleans, which plays fast and loose with historical facts. In the play, Joan falls in love with an English knight, and her subsequent capture is configured as a fitting punishment for failing in her mission to deliver France. However, once she realises that the French are in danger of defeat, she breaks out of her prison and dies on the battlefield under the French flag, after leading her army to victory in a Kantian triumph of duty over inclination. Now, that's quite a change, isn't it? To actually move Joan from the stake to die on the battlefield. It's an interpretation. Interpretation number 2. In 1999, Luc Besson's film The Messenger appeared, the story of Joan of Arc. And this complicates Joan's motivations by showing how, as a child, she witnesses the violent death of her sister at the hands of English troops, thereby suggesting that her later career is driven by revenge. Besson gives her a supernatural mentor, who is a blend of confessor and accuser. And I always think when I see this film that Joan seems to have wandered into medieval France from a computer game. Interpretation number 3. Let's go back to 1980, the orchestral manoeuvres in the dark, electronic band from Liverpool, who foregrounded Joan of Arc in 2 songs on their 1980 album, Architecture and Morality. Joan of Arc relocates her as a character in a contemporary love story. Maid of Orleans celebrates the heroic warrior who is willing to embrace death. The tracks complement each other and form 2 musical takes on a legend whose power reaches beyond biography to those alive today. And interpretation number 4, Shaw's Joan. Another gadfly who disturbs those around her, just like Socrates teaching by the Adriatic. For example, when the Dauphin tells her that he wants to be left alone to lead a life of pleasant inactivity, rather than fight for his throne, her reply is, "Blethers, we are all like that to begin with. I shall put courage into thee." I like that line. I'm going to read it again. "Blethers, we are all like that to begin with. I shall put courage into thee." Poor Charles. He just wants peace and quiet. And that's precisely what she is not going to give him. The first word of her reply, this shaving coinage, "blethers," sums her up and indicates the stubbornness that will enable her to get Charles crowned, but that will also take her to the stake. As the stage direction puts it, she is, and I quote, "trenchant and masterful." Trenchant and masterful. She refuses to cooperate with the received view of the world, just like Socrates could not resist putting questions to the curious young men of Athens. And like Socrates, she will pay dearly for it. Shaw investigates the minds of Socrates and Joan and postulates a further link, as he says, both of them combined terrifying ability with a frankness, personal modesty and benevolence, which made the furious dislike to which they fell victims absolutely unreasonable, and therefore inapprehensible by themselves. Plato's Apology and Shaw's St Joan show 2 characters who function differently from the rest of us. Why? They see beyond. When Socrates was found guilty at his trial, he was actually asked to name his punishment. So he said he should be kept in luxury for the rest of his life at the state's expense. Oddly enough, they turned him down. And they said, we've got another suggestion. He said, well, why not fine me the equivalent of 50 pence? That would seem about right for that. He didn't get away with that either. What was he doing? He was saying blethers to the Athenian judges. Now at last, he bowed to the inevitable and drank the poisoned chalice, just as Joan tore up her recantation and accepted burning rather than face a life of dishonourable captivity. It remained a puzzle to both Joan and Socrates why they should have inspired such hatred. The answer's simple, but profound. They would not leave people alone. They still won't. They still won't. Socrates continues to sting through the writings of Plato, and a powerful interpretation of Joan lives for our time and for all time in the play that bears her name by Shaw. A play that is not about a philosopher, but that in my opinion does philosophy. Because it works out what it means to be a Protestant before your time. And it therefore makes us, as readers or as spectators, see the world differently. It's a paradigm case of a very special sort of attention. And the singularity of its performance can trigger visceral responses that bypass rational inquiry. Now, philosophy is all about rational inquiry, isn't it? Well, yes and no. The philosopher Stanley Cavell argues that the arts can prompt what he calls mysterious thoughts and feelings in us, amorphous, latent thoughts and feelings, in a way that analysis cannot. Now that's important. The arts can prompt mysterious thoughts and feelings in us, amorphous, latent thoughts and feelings, in a way that analysis cannot. One example, I think, of how Shaw does make drama do philosophy is to be found in the interaction between Robert de Baudricourt and Joan in scene 1. Joan has just set out on her journey, and she finds Robert in a very bad mood. Why? Because his hens are not laying. She presents him with an account of her visions, to which he makes, I think, a very reasonable response, that she only sees them in her imagination. It's a great response, isn't it? Rational, yeah? And you only see these saints, etc., in your imagination. What does Joan say? Of course, that is how the messages of God come to us. Of course, that is how the messages of God come to us. That's an amazing dramatic trick that Shaw performs here, one I think that stays with the audience, because he suggests and maintains two possibilities. Either Joan really is inspired by God, or she's hopelessly deluded. Now, literature can keep these contradictions in play in a way that philosophy can't. Philosophers tend to want to eliminate contradictions from their work in the instances of consistency. They're looking to be consistent. So if something's contradictory, get rid of it. Literature, on the other hand, is much more at home with ambiguity. Imogen Stubbs, one of many actors who've taken on the role of Shaw's Joan, and as I said, I saw her on stage here in London, she argues that Joan can be considered either miraculous or unbearable. Either miraculous or unbearable. And I think we can go further. Joan is both miraculous and unbearable. I'm reminded of how the philosopher Simone Weil insists that philosophers should change their ways and should attempt to maintain contradictions in their work. She cites the passage in the Upanishads in which there are two birds on a branch, one looking at the fruit and the other eating it. And by the end of the scene, Robert's hens are laying eggs. He is convinced that a sign has been given to him, that Joan's mission has divine support. or they could just as easily be a coincidence. If an essential part of a miracle is how it's conceived and how it's received by people, then we can argue that the laying of the eggs is both a miracle and a coincidence. It sure leaves it up to the audience to decide one or the other, miracle or coincidence, or to keep both possibilities in mind. The dramatist's ability to hold ambiguity in play makes the play more relevant than ever to our own age, which is often spoken of as characterised by ambiguity. As Imogen Stubbs says, Shaw's Joan is the right one to be received by the 21st century. The right one to be received by the 21st century. Now, let's actually bring a new voice in at this point. One philosopher I spend a lot of time working on is the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, how can I sum Wittgenstein up in a couple of sentences? I can't. I'm going to have a go. Wittgenstein said to his fellow philosophers, he says, don't think, look. Now, that's an amazing thing to say again, isn't it? Because philosophy is supposed to be all about thinking, isn't it? You know, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. But Wittgenstein said, don't think, look. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Ludwig Wittgenstein, describing what might be thought of as the most simple thing in the world, a trip to the shop to buy apples. And Alexis is going to play the part of this great philosopher.
Now, think of the following use of language. I send someone shopping. I give him a slip marked 5 red apples. He takes the slip to the shopkeeper, who opens the drawer marked apples. Then he looks up the word red in a table and finds a colour sample opposite it. Then he says a series of cardinal numbers. I assume he knows them by heart. Up to the word 5. And for each number, he takes an apple of the same colour as the sample out of the drawer. It is in this and similar ways that one operates with words. But how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red? And what is he to do with the word 5? Well, I assume that he acts as I have described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. But what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing is in question here. Only how the word 5 is used.
So philosophy for Wittgenstein is about looking. In that, I could call it, I suppose we could call it a thought experiment, but in that story, 3 different things are going on in that trip for apples. We've got to work out the type of fruit, the colour of the fruit, the number of fruit we want to buy. And it shows the nature of meaning. Now, meaning is something that philosophers have been trying to work out ever since, well, I guess ever since Socrates. And maybe Wittgenstein's done it, because he says, don't look at the meaning, look at the use. But look at his method. He does it not by an argument, but by a dramatic presentation, which kind of asks you to meet in the middle. And in that way, Wittgenstein's writing is kind of like poetry. In fact, he once said that philosophy ought to be written as a form of poetry. Now, if you think about poetry, okay, let's have a little experiment of our own. Let's imagine William Wordsworth is writing a poem, and he goes to one of his friends and says, I've written a poem. We listen to it, and they say, oh, I'd love to, let's go for it, William. And Wordsworth says, it's about loneliness. Here we go. Loneliness. I am lonely. Wow, I am lonely. I am so lonely. Loneliness is my middle name. And the friend says, don't think that's very good, actually, because, you know, there's nothing for me to do. You know, you're just telling me something. Have another go. Okay, a week later, Wordsworth comes back, very pleased with himself, and he says, I've had another go, what do you think? His friend says, okay, let's listen to it. And Wordsworth says, the solipsism of the existential angst that I instantiate has been represented by a self that transcends that which it is. And the friend says, didn't understand a word of that. Really, that's really not going to work. Go on, have another go. So poor old Wordsworth comes back, and he comes back a week later and says, I've had another go. And he says, what have you got? And Wordsworth says, well, I don't know if you like it. He goes like this. I wandered lonely as a cloud. And the friend says, I think you may have done it. Do you know, I think that might catch on. And we could have something there. Let's run with that. So, and I think that's what Wittgenstein's doing here. And in some ways, I think that's what literature does. Literature is about meeting in the middle. Now, Wittgenstein once said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. And I want to try and see if Shaw can cast some light on that. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. So let's turn to a favourite Shaw character, Eliza Doolittle. Now, Eliza Doolittle has an early and a later version. Let's hear from the Flower Girl first, and then from Eliza after she's been tutored by Henry Higgins. And remember that it's the same person. I'm going to keep standing while you're reading, by the way.
Sorry?
I'm going to keep standing for this one, because this is a bit more of a double act. So first of all, I'd like to imagine Eliza in Covent Garden by St Paul's Church, which of course is really not very far from here. And here we are, Eliza, as we first meet her in the play.
There's manners for ya. 2 bunches of violets trod into the mud. Oh, it's your son, is he? Well, if you've done your duty by him as a mother should, he'd know better than to spoil a poor girl's flowers than run away without paying. Will you pay me for them?
Eliza Doolittle, the flower girl, in Covent Garden. But of course, Eliza changes throughout the play because she goes to Henry Higgins. Now let's hear Eliza after she's had some tuition.
The shallow depression in the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction. There are no indications of any great change in the barometrical situation.
Same person. It's astonishing, isn't it? But things don't go that well between Eliza and Henry, so can't she just go back to being a flower girl?
I can't. I could have done it once, but now I can't go back to it. Last night, when I was wandering about, a girl spoke to me, and I tried to get back into the old way with her, but it was no use. You told me, you know, that when a child is brought to a foreign country, it picks up the language in a few weeks and forgets its own. Well, I have a child in your country. I have forgotten my own language and can speak nothing but yours. That's the real break-off with the corner of Tottenham Court Road. Leaving Wimpole Street finishes it.
So, the 1912 drama Pygmalion, which introduces the Covent Garden flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, to the expert linguist Henry Higgins, who takes her on as a pupil, wagering that he can pass her up as a duchess. Famous story. Important questions about class are raised by this play. Because when Higgins is successful, does that mean that social status can be deconstructed as a matter of how we speak? The vocabulary we use, the tone of voice we adopt, how we speak, the vocabulary we use, the tone of voice we adopt. What does Higgins' success tell us about the way that society is organised? And is Eliza the same person at the end of the play? Pygmalion is a dramatic thought experiment that test the dictum we heard from Wittgenstein, Shaw's contemporary. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Is Wittgenstein right? Well, engaging with Pygmalion, I think, is one way of finding out. The play performs philosophy. Is she a different person? Or is she just being treated differently? Or does that amount to the same thing? And note how, and this is really important, she can't go back to where she was. Not anymore. That path can't be taken again. So what is the answer? Or maybe, what are the answers? Well, we live in times that are sensitive to appropriation. And Shaw's Joan resolutely remains a figure, I think, that cannot be co-opted into other causes. Marina Warner has shown how different parties have adopted Joan to promote their view of the world, as in the secular and sacred iconography, to which I referred before with respect to statues of Joan in her homeland. Go to France, go to your average town square, and there she is on horseback, the symbol of independent France. Go to the Catholic Church just off that square, and there she is, the symbol of France, the oldest daughter of the Catholic Church, as it's known. In the epilogue of St Joan, a gentleman, interesting word, a gentleman arrives from the Vatican to announce that Joan has been officially canonized by the Catholic Church. It is the year 1920, some 500 years after that same church ordered her to be burned alive. Joan's attitude is one of amusement. The stage direction indicates that she chuckles at the news. That's not the attitude of a Catholic saint, but it may very well be the attitude of a Protestant saint in Shaw's use of the term Protestant. As with Blethers, I think Shaw's genius comes out in these small details. Joan is elevated to the same rank of the saints who inspired her, and she finds it amusing. Although there is an immediate shift in her attitude when she realises that the world still will not accept her as she really is. The play ends with her on her knees, asking when the earth will be ready to receive God's saints. That question remains unanswered. Shaw's Joan is beyond this world. She is a saint beyond sanctity, and a hero beyond heroism. She persists in her innocence. So today in this beautiful church, we've examined Shaw's own Protestant portrayal of St Joan in the light of his linking of her to the founder of Western philosophy, Socrates. Both these historical figures needed interpreters to bring them to the world. Socrates immediately found his interpreter in his student Plato, and Joan in time found George Bernard Shaw, whose genius it was to realise how what he called mental giants, who do not intend harm, are destroyed by those who are both envious and fearful. Socrates thought that the unexamined life was not worth living, and Joan chose a painful death rather than lead a life examined only by others. Such heroism is frightening, but also liberating, and St Joan keeps this contradiction in play. Through his dramatic work, Shaw, the gadfly, continues to examine life, so that others may find it worth living. But I think today the final words should go to Joan. Here, she is going to speak to her judges at her trial. She has been condemned to life imprisonment. She's effectively asking to be burned rather than imprisoned for life. And she is speaking to her judges, but of course, she's speaking to the audience. And today, that audience is you, Alexis.
Yes, They told me you were fools, and that I was not to listen to your fine words, nor trust to your charity. You promised me my life, but you lied. You think that life is nothing but not being stone dead. It's not the bread and water I fear. I can live on bread. When have I asked for more? It is no hardship to drink water, if the water be clean. Bread has no sorrow for me, and water no affliction. But to shut me from the light of the sky, and the sight of the fields and the flowers, to chain my feet, so I can never ride again with the soldiers, nor climb the hills, to make me breathe foul, damp darkness, and keep me from everything that brings me back to the love of God, when your wickedness and foolishness tempt me to hate him. All this is worse than the furnace in the Bible that was heated 7 times. I could do without my war horse. I could drag about in a skirt. I could let the banners and the trumpets and the knights and soldiers pass me and leave me behind as they leave the other women. If only I could still hear the wind in the trees, the larks in the sunshine, the young lambs crying through the healthy frost, and the blessed, blessed church bells that send my angel voices floating to me on the wind. But without these things, I cannot live. And with your wanting to take them away from me, or from any human creature, I know your counsel is with the devil, and mine is with God.
Thank you. Well, philosophers always say that the most important part of lectures are the questions afterwards. We do have to, Helen, I think we have some time for some questions. Yes, so if anybody would like to ask a question of either of us, or we have a lot of Shaw experts in the room as well, we might be able to, if you ask me some detail about manuscript of St Joan, I'm not able to answer, I'm afraid. Or any comments anybody's got to make. We've got one at the back there. Do you want to use the microphone?
I was just wondering.